The Dr. Taz Show, the podcast. Dr. Taz, Superwoman Wellness. Here's Dr. Taz.
Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to this episode of Superwoman Wellness, where on every episode of the show, I am determined to bring you back to your superpowered self. Joining me from London, from the UK, is Samuel Pollen. He is an author of the book, The Year I Didn't Eat, a book all about eating disorders, but this time, eating disorders in our teens, specifically boys. Samuel, welcome to the show. This is a really important topic, and I can't wait to dive into it because I think that for all of us, I'll have to admit, even for myself, when we think eating disorders, we are typically thinking about girls, right? And girls at risk. And you have a very different experience. I'm sure everyone wants to hear your story. And then we'll talk a little bit more about this really troubling epidemic of eating disorders.
Great. Yeah. Firstly, thanks very much for having me. Good to be here.
You're welcome.
What you said in the run-up is kind of exactly true. Most of us think of eating disorders as primarily something that happen classically to teenage girls or young women. But actually they affect a lot of different people. About a quarter of eating disorder sufferers are men, depending on which estimates you look at. There's lots of figures around, but and also beyond that, there's also people of all ages, people of all ethnicities, people of all socioeconomic backgrounds. So yeah, it's quite a mixed picture, which is part of why I wanted to tell this story.
So what do you think do you see the rates of eating disorders on the rise? What do you think is driving it? Give us a little bit of background with this particular condition and what you're seeing.
Yeah, so certainly my understanding is that the broad picture is that eating disorder rates are on the rise. I think that's partly, it sounds confusing, but partly a good story, because I think it's partly because we're recognizing them more and we're dealing with them more, and people are getting help that they didn't get help with in the past. Right. But also I think it probably reflects a genuine rise in rates, and that has a complex set of causes. That's probably partly to do with the healthcare system. I think it's probably partly to do with the internet age and the kind of different ways we think about ourselves and our personal image and the way people see us now.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, that's a lot to unpack in our little time together here. But talk to us about your experience. What happened? What was the motivation for writing this book? Why this particular issue for you? Give me a sense of that.
Sure. So I was about 12 when I first developed an eating disorder. I'm 31 now, by the way. So, and I've not had an eating disorder for a long time. But yeah, I was about 12. And when young men get eating disorders, it tends to be a little bit earlier in their lives. That often happens kind of at just that sort of around the puberty kind of age. Yep. And that was the case for me. And that's obviously, there's no good age to deal with an eating disorder, but that's a particularly tricky age because you're also learning how to be a teenager and how to be an adult, and kind of, your whole life is changing around you. You're in the UK, right. You're going to a different school at that age. So there's a lot going on. And so that was a really hard thing I had to deal with. I was lucky enough to have relatively supportive people around me, but a lot of the people around me, just because they weren't looking out for this thing in a young man, they didn't really recognize it. So I didn't really necessarily have people to talk to about that. There wasn't really support networks that existed, certainly for young men going through something like that at the time. I think that's got a bit better in the sort of, I guess it's nearly 20 years since that was the case. But yeah, there's a lot to deal with.
Oh my goodness. So how did it look? What was an eating disorder like for you? Did you simply not eat, more like the anorexia type scenario, or were you eating and purging? What were you doing? How did you exhibit some of these behaviors? And what do you think triggered it? Was it purely stress or hormones, or what do you think the trigger was behind it?
Yeah, well, what I think triggered it is a really hard question to answer, because I think that's the part of the big problem with eating disorders is we don't fully understand how they occur, and what happens. I was anorexic. I was diagnosed with anorexia, and it was, I think even with anorexia that varies a lot, but for me it was more and more regular exercise. I used to run. I still run, actually. I run perfectly healthily now, but there was a long period where I couldn't run healthily. And yeah, so I was exercising more and more and eating less and less. It was a very kind of restrictive, kind of slow, and I think that can be a particularly tricky kind of eating disorders to deal with, because it's more invisible maybe than if you are, you know, purging and
Right.
it feels it's you can convince yourself you're just doing the same as what you were doing yesterday, but you're doing slightly less of it or slightly more of it, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And I think in my med school, somewhere in the second or third year, you know, that started to happen to some of us, quite honestly. And it became sort of like I don't know what the word is for it, like a cluster where one or two of the girls were over exercising and eating less and less and eating less and less and over exercising more and eating less and less. And it kind of started spreading to the rest of us, where everybody started to do that. And it was completely a reaction to stress and not being able to control, you know, what was going on in our environment. You know, did your family notice? Did anyone pick up on the fact that that was happening with you? Was there a change in weight or a change in behavior or anything else that would have maybe clued somebody in?
Sure. So people noticed. It took a little while for them to notice, to be frank. And I think the main kind of trigger point for that was me getting ill. I got the flu,
Mm-hmm.
and I saw a doctor through the course of that, and he kind of told me and told my family how underweight I was. I'd lost a lot of weight. There was a big behavioral shift in that I didn't really want to spend time with people. I went straight home after school, and I was kind of trying to avoid social contact. But I think that partly ties into what I was saying about I was also becoming a teenager, and a lot of those changes happen when you become a teenager anyway, right? You're suddenly very shy, you suddenly don't want to spend time with people, you're going through a lot of confusing changes. So I do think it's hard for any family to kind of read that situation and go, that's an eating disorder, because I think it also look like a lot of other things that are happening then.
So how long did your eating disorder in particular last? Did it last for a few years, or did it go away quickly, or what happened?
Yeah, so it's kind of really hard to put a sort of start date and end date.
Yeah.
I think it was roughly 2 years, something like
Okay.
that in total, in terms of kind of from when I started sort of obviously having an eating disorder, I guess, to the point where I was discharged from regular treatment. There's probably then a longer period where I was very careful about my relationship with food and kind of watched myself very closely. But yeah, I had in many ways I was very lucky. A lot of people have eating disorders for a lot longer and kind of relapse and have a really tricky time kind of going forward. And that's just that's partly your circumstances and the support you have, but also partly just good or bad luck. So kind of once I had treatment, I did have a relatively smooth recovery.
Wonderful. And what did treatment look like, out of curiosity?
Yeah, so it was I was seeing a clinical psychologist. I'm not sure exactly what the role would be in the US, but
Similar, probably very similar. Psychologist, psychiatrist.
on I think a weekly basis.
Yeah.
I had a dietitian who kind of designed meal plans for me and was kind of working with me to put on weight. I think it was it's that kind of combination of practical things that are solving, because obviously a weird thing with eating disorders is that they have this immediate threat to your health, right? Is that if you lose too much weight and if you are too underweight, it can cause other kinds of damage that is over and above the psychological issue. You have a physical issue that you need to deal with. So there's that kind of practical level, and then the changing your thought patterns, kind of changing your relationship with food, which takes longer, but which is vital for you to carry on having a healthy life afterwards.
Did it require any medication, or was it mainly just sort of like more cognitive behavioral type stuff? And
yeah, exactly, it was
cognitive behavioral therapy.
I mean, I'm recalling when I was 12, 13, right? So I didn't fully understand what was going on, but I didn't have medicine as part of my
medicines. Okay, perfect. And then, I'm sitting here listening to you, and I have a son, and I'm sure a lot of the audience, some of them are moms, or they have a brother or somebody that's in their life that they are concerned about. How do we pick up, like, how are men's experiences of an eating disorder maybe different from that of a female or a woman? I feel like, I guess where I'm going with this, I feel like as a woman, I can pick up very quickly if my daughter is starting to develop signs of an eating disorder, because I don't know, there's just something that's very easy to see and intuitive about that. How do we pick it up in our sons and our husbands and, our brothers? What is the difference there that we really should be looking for?
Well, I think it's really hard.
Yeah.
is the short thing. I think partly because a lot of what eating disorders are about, at least partially, is kind of is chasing this ideal of of the person you want to be, the person you want to look like, the person you have in your head that you can't reach.
Mm-hmm.
And for men, I think that's a much more complicated. I think for women, the pressure on women's bodies is often relentlessly downwards. You have to be thinner, and that's the message that I think
Right.
a lot of the media would give about women's bodies. Whereas I think for men it's a much more complicated picture because you also have things like you have various kinds of body dysmorphia and different problems in men, and that's partly because men's ideals of what they should look like are really complex and varied.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of things to spot, I think, obviously excessive exercise is a very common thing. I mean, I'm not a doctor, so I don't want to kind of give
right.
full
Just from your perspective. How's that?
Yeah, from my personal perspective.
Yeah.
And things that were definitely triggers for me was that kind of social withdrawal, for one thing. A kind of big change in the way I related to other people and my kind of comfort level with being in social situations. I mean, I think we don't really think about it when we're eating healthily, but almost everything we do socially involves food. We meet people for meals and we meet people for drinks and we go to the cinema and have snacks, and that's just like a normal part of almost everything socially. And so for me, withdrawing from those situations was a kind of big, obvious change. I avoided any situation that was kind of social. And that the exercise was the other thing for me, doing more and more exercise. And I think, lots of young boys exercise perfectly healthily. Again, it's that challenge of kind of determining what is a comfortable, healthy level of doing something, and when is it tipping over into something that is not being done happily and not being done sustainably and healthily.
Gotcha. So over-exercise may be more common in boys than girls who might try to control their eating more. And that's something I think I've seen in practice too. So that might be a helpful tip for anybody out there who's trying to sort through that and try to understand if their son or their brother or husband might be suffering from something like that. We talked about when we started, like the growing rate of eating or the perceived growing rate of eating disorders, whether it's just from better identification or it's an actual growing rate. How much of that has been, affected by social media, by Instagram and, all this everyone's taking pictures constantly. They say that rhinoplasty has gone up significantly because of Instagram. What about eating disorders? Tell us if there's a correlation there.
Yeah, so it's I've been asked this question a few times, and it's a really tricky one because firstly, I should say, when I had an eating disorder, I had dial-up internet at home, So I've come from, obviously I've thought about this a lot because I wrote a book about my experiences, and I was writing a character who was dealing with an eating disorder now in our contemporary world, which with a smartphone and all of those things. But yeah, so my own experience was kind of before that was really happening. But definitely, I think we are asked to think about how we look and present to other people more and more. And I think social media is a really good example of that. I don't think it's the only example of that. I think, but I think it's made that much more common. And everyone kind of to some extent now lives through other people's image of them. And I think that's something that can cause a lot of problems. People's when your happiness comes from this kind of image that you're projecting of yourself rather than kind of how you feel internally, that mismatch can cause real issues for people. So I think that definitely has contributed. I think it's hard to say how much that's contributed versus other things going on in society, but I definitely think it's a factor.
I think it's a huge factor. And I think, one of the things I'm a huge advocate for is keeping some of this out of the hands of our younger children, like our middle school children, because I don't think they have the emotional maturity to manage the images coming at you constantly and then being able to filter. I have trouble as an adult. I don't know how they're doing it. I'm like, why don't I look like that? Come on, guys. So, I have trouble as an adult. So I can't imagine being like a middle schooler or, even a high schooler and trying to navigate this. I don't really know what the answer is, but I do think that a part of it is that we've become very image focused. And, if we don't have a particular image, it can lead to anxiety, depression, and then trigger into an eating disorder. So I do think that that's one factor. The other things I've seen clinically, just in practice, I think extreme stress, like I talked about my med school example, I've seen that trigger into an eating disorder. I've seen trauma or any abuse, be a trigger for an eating disorder as well. And then where the science, bringing my doctor hat in, where the science is sort of leading us is that, all those things may not even be in the picture, but it could be a microbiome issue. It could be a gut hormone issue that as the hormones change and the gut bacteria change is triggering this change in behavior. So these are all things for anybody out there listening who's trying to sift through, like, why did this happen, or what's going on, or do these pieces add up for a particular child or person? Those are things to maybe think about. And this next question, is one that I'm so curious what you have to, what your answer will be. Do you think people recover from eating disorders long term, or do you think it's one of those things that can flare if the right set of circumstances exist? Or it's almost like it's not really a psychological disease, it's more of an autoimmune type disease, and it can flare if you have hit 1, hit 2, hit 3. What do you think?
Right. Well, so my one word answer is yes. I think people do recover from eating disorders. I definitely
Wonderful.
Yeah.
That's good news.
Yeah. I think, I partly talk from my own experience there. I haven't struggled with my eating since I recovered from eating disorder, and that's now 15 years ago or something like that. I think that very much depends on what was causing it, as you pointed to several different causes and several different factors, and obviously those pressures sometimes go away and then come back, and things in people's lives change that cause them to go back. And I don't know that I would nothing could ever cause me to relapse. There might well be things that could cause me to relapse, but they haven't happened in my life yet. So I guess it partly becomes a semantic thing about how you define recovery, because I think there's always potential for things to go wrong in our lives in the future. That sounds like a very negative thing.
No, I mean, I just think it's realistic. So I think it's important. What I found, I think it's incredibly important if you suffer personally from an eating disorder, or someone is, that you're aware, just like any other disease. I think that's the important thing to remember, that this is a disease, just like lupus might be, just like, rheumatoid arthritis might be, just like we think about ADHD. This is actually a condition, and it's not just something somebody's reacting to. So I think for any condition, we have to know, what your triggers are, what works for you, what your tipping point is, what throws you over the edge, and I think it's important for everyone to just have that list. And the minute they feel life spinning and getting out of control, and maybe some of those forces coming back, they know to go back to how to live to make them feel better, and how to live to make them feel in balance, so they can get out of sort of spiraling downhill like that. So I think that is not being negative at all. I think it's just being very pragmatic and very realistic, that this has happened. What do we do in the future to make sure it doesn't happen again? What are the things that you need to look out for? And I don't think there's anything wrong with kind of that approach. I know this book, and again, the book, everyone, is The Year I Didn't Eat, is really targeted at a younger audience. What were you hoping for the younger folks? What were you hoping they would walk away and take away from this book when they read it?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I wanted to tell a story that I thought was authentic for me to tell, which was about a kind of younger person going through this, right? And I also kind of looked at the market and looked at what was out there, and felt there weren't that many books. So there are lots of books about, as you might expect, there are lots of books about eating disorder that are aimed at later teenage or kind of young adult.
Right.
Which is great, and there's lots of great books out there that do that. There wasn't so much for that kind of, so my book is kind of 11 to 15, that sort of age group. And there isn't too much out there for that audience. But eating disorder rates are going up in kids that age, and that felt like something that, it was important to have a book that was out there that was dealing with a protagonist, with a character, Max, the central character in my book, at that age, both for people going through it and also people around people going through it. So a lot of people have spoken to me, which is a really lovely thing to hear, that they have a friend who's going through something like that. They have a
Right.
son or a daughter who's going through something like that. And I think eating disorders in general, a lot of the experiences happen regardless of how old you are and regardless of your circumstances. But they're also quite specific. When you're going through them, they feel unique and they feel like no one can relate to the experience that you're having. And it's I think having something that feels as like you as possible and as like your own experience as possible can be hugely valuable for people to kind of, when they're working out how to deal with that.
Wonderful. And if you had to give one kind of maybe 3 pieces of advice to somebody out there who's suffering from an eating disorder, or to a parent or a spouse or someone who's worried that somebody they love is suffering from an eating disorder, what would the 3 things be? I always like to leave everybody with a checklist. My daughter makes fun of me with my list, but what would the 3 things be that you would really want them to be like, hey, just remember this if you don't remember anything else?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I would say was something that I might not have believed at the time. I was going through an eating disorder, but I think it's a really important message anyway. And the more we say it, the more I think people might be able to relate to it, is that you're not alone. Other people have been through things that are similar, and it might not feel like their experience is quite the same, but they were having the same feelings, they were dealing with the same things, and it felt impossible to them too, and they got through it. I guess the second thing would be the importance of kind of connections, of talking to people. And specifically, I think connections that aren't just about dealing with that problem. So as I was recovering and as I was working through kind of a recovery process, it was really valuable to me to have social time, spend time with people where they weren't asking me about my eating disorder and about what was going on. They were just talking to me about the soccer or the weather or whatever. Like, it doesn't matter what it was, but other things that were just normal. Because I think that social withdrawal is such a big part of eating disorders, that those you feel like you're never going to know how to be a normal person again, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And then a third thing, I think I'd probably say that medical help is a really important part of.
Good job.
It's a really important part of it.
Hey, he's going to say me. Pick me.
You can't recover from an eating disorder without medical support. At least it's incredibly hard thing to do, and you shouldn't try it. You need professional support, and that's vital. And that was that's the reason I'm here to tell you about that.
I think you said it best. I think if anybody out there who's listening to this, or somebody who's suffering from an eating disorder, maybe let them listen to this particular episode, because I think when you're in the middle of it, you feel really alone and you don't know where to turn to, and you think that you're the only one who's gone through something like this. But to Samuel's point, creating community, creating connection, and really reaching out and seeking help and being honest with your doctor. I've got to tell the story before we go, because it just struck me. In my practice, I have an integrative practice, and we do a lot of work with food and nutrition and stuff like that. And I had this one particular patient who literally had been coming to me for 18 months and had been talking about the different foods she should and should not eat, had done food intolerance testing, so was avoiding some of those foods on that test, and was having all these symptoms like bloating and trouble sleeping and like all this other stuff. And finally, by the 8th visit is when she told me, she's like, I'm suffering from an eating disorder and I'm purging at night and I'm throwing up in the day, and then I'm trying to follow your plan. But it took her like literally the 8th visit, and I had no idea. So I think being really honest with your medical provider, because unless it's really obvious, we'll pick it up. But if we don't know the full extent of what you're going through, sometimes we just don't. And I'll never forget her case or her. And I know you can definitely relate and resonate to that too. So just really important to remember some of these pieces of advice. And the book, everyone, is The Year I Didn't Eat. It is aimed at our tweens and teens, the 10 to 15-year-olds. I've got 2 of those in my home right now, and really hoping to educate them in the age of social media how to really navigate this particular issue when image seems like it's everything. Samuel, thank you so much for joining me today. Where can the audience connect with you?
Thank you very much for having me. You can find me at my website, samuelpollen.com, and on various other social medias as well. But if you search Samuel Pollen, you'll find me in all the places.
Awesome. Wonderful. Well, thank you for taking time all the way over in London to join me. Are you in London, or where are you exactly?
I'm in London, yes.
I saw UK and I was like, London, typical. Anyhow, thank you for taking time for joining me today. For everybody else, thank you for listening to this episode of Superwoman Wellness, where we hope that you are finding your superpowers. If you enjoyed this episode, remember we're on Spotify as well, so remember to rate and review it and share it with your friends. I will see you guys next time.